Hello and welcome to the Knowledge and Learning Commons at the UN Library and Archives, Geneva, for a new episode of our HiStories series, where we dive into the history of multilateralism through the UN Archives, Geneva. Welcome back. I'm Amy Smith, and today we're going to be looking at the continuities and the ruptures between the League of Nations and the United Nations. And in doing so, we'll explore the legacy of the League of Nations to gain a better understanding of the history of these two global international organizations and to discover more on the history of multilateralism from a quite innovative perspective. If you have any questions whilst we're watching this episode, you're welcome to use our Ask an Archivist or Ask a Librarian service, and we're here to help. And the contact details will be posted in the notes and will be on screen later. We have a very interesting panel for you today. In this HiStories episode, we brought together researchers and practitioners to provide different perspectives on the continuities and the ruptures between the League of Nations and the United Nations. So it's my great pleasure to welcome our three speakers. First of all, we have Professor Karen Gram-Skjoldager. She's Associate Professor and Director of the Research Program for History at Aarhus University in Denmark. She has worked extensively on the history of international organizations and the League of Nations Secretariat, as well as on the emergence of international public administration. Welcome, Karen. So among your latest publications, and it's a very long list, you co-edited a book called Organizing the 20th Century World, International Organizations and the Emergence of International Public Administration, 1920s to 1960s. The book is available at the library and we highly recommend it. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Dickinson. Robert, you're a former translator and you worked here at the UN office at Geneva, and it was whilst you were serving here at the UN that you began to research the history of the translation service of the League of Nations. And you've been continuing this research since your retirement not so long ago, and also thanks, I imagine, to the fact that the archives of the League of Nations are now entirely digitized and available for free online. So your research currently focuses on integration of the translation service into the institutional structure of the League Secretariat. Welcome, Robert. And finally, we have with us Stefan Vukotic. Stefan is currently Associate Drug Control and Crime Prevention Officer at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna. But we also know him very, very well at the Library and Archives because he was a former colleague working with us as Chief of the Archives Management Unit. Today, his work consists in monitoring and supporting member states in their application of the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs at the Secretariat of the International Narcotics Control Board. This body is directly descended from the League of Nations Permanent Central Opium Board. Thanks to all three of you for joining us today. So let's start perhaps with Professor Gram-Skjoldager. Another of your publications is a volume you co-edited called The League of Nations, Perspectives from the Present. This book investigates how the League affected the world around it and the lives of people who became part of what Lord Robert Cecil called the first great experiment in international organization. So Karen, we're really interested in how you can help us have a better understanding of the perception of the League's legacy. So perhaps we could start with a question to you. Because the League of Nations has often been presented as a failed predecessor to the United Nations, and the League's legacy has almost been seen as a burden for the UN. However, in the past couple of decades, the view of the League's experience has changed. Can you tell us how the League of Nations historiography has evolved over the years and why it's so relevant today to study its history?
Well, thanks, Amy. Thanks so much for having me. That's a great question, and one that we've been exploring as part of our research is why has the League been perceived the way it has? And I think roughly you can divide, as you also do in your question, the League historiography into two generations. So for the first decades after the Second World War, maybe up until the 1980s, the main narrative in historiographical research was that the League had failed, an interpretation that was built on an assumption that the League was first and foremost a security organization. It was set up with the aim of preventing another world war, and it failed at that mission, and so the organization was a failure. And it's a very understandable perspective to adopt, given that in the first decades after the World War, researchers in general were trying to understand what had happened in the 1930s, why the international system had collapsed, and why the Second World War had broken out. And research on the League was very much shaped by those perspectives for the first 3 or 4 decades after the war. Then we had a couple of decades where hardly anybody took an interest in the League. And then, as you also hint at, when we get to the early 2000s, then all of a sudden there was a second wave of research on the League that took a very different approach, and very much assumed that the League was not only interesting as a security political player in the interwar years, but also as a critical institution in the creation of modern multilateralism and international global governance. So what happened in the early 2000s was that researchers started looking into all the other policy areas that the League had also operated in, be it drug control, as Stefan is now involved in, global health, transport, economy. So all these other policy areas that actually took up the majority of the League's time and effort, and exploring those as sort of precedents of a lot of the work that the UN does today, breaking away from thinking about the League in terms of success and failure, and instead working out what did it actually do and what did it mean to the people who were involved in the League. So that's a very rough outline of where historiography is at the moment.
Thank you. So this is, in a way, what makes the work of historians so important, you know, understanding these ruptures and continuities between the two organizations and just how complex that is. We see perhaps today in our current international context that some observers have started to make a parallel between the League of Nations and the United Nations, and perhaps some think that history is almost repeating itself. Could you tell us, in your opinion, what the major ruptures and continuities are between the two organizations?
Well, I think that's a very complex picture. But if we start sort of at the institutional level, there are some really deep continuities in the sense that a lot of the infrastructure, both in terms of personnel, but also the way of organizing international work, was transferred from the League to the United Nations in the immediate post-war years. But I also think there are some very important ruptures to note. One is that what was learned from the League, and where there was general agreement that it had failed, was that it didn't have enough institutional muscle. So what happened after the war was that more power was given to the Secretary General. He was given a right of initiative. He was given the explicit authority to hire international staff and so on, to create more autonomy for the organization. And I also think it's important to remember that even if the policy areas are more or less the same, there's a huge difference of scale. When the League Secretariat was at its largest, it had a staff of 700, and now I guess it's roughly between 35,000 and 40,000 members of staff worldwide with the UN. So the UN is a completely different animal in the sense that it is a highly professionalized, differentiated, bureaucratized, routinized bureaucracy that works much more professionally and structured with the issues. Whereas if you look at the League, from today's perspective, it was really very improvised. It was sort of making the rules as they went along, so to speak. So they have very different sort of institutional feels to them. And then obviously there are also things to consider about the broader political contexts in which the League operated compared with now. And I think one of the reasons why the League has come into fashion is that there are some clear similarities between the international system today and the international system of the interwar periods, the multipolar structure, the rupture in international order after the First World War, the role of nationalism and populism that's built onto the international stage. All those qualities of interwar politics are really recognizable from a present perspective. But at the same time, it's important to remember that the League was basically an imperial organization, for instance, set up by European states that were still the centers of global empires, whereas the UN has very much been shaped by decolonization and decolonization processes, which is also the reason why the League had 50 member states, whereas the UN has close to 200. So there are some striking similarities, but also some very fundamental differences that are important to consider when we make these comparisons.
These are very important points. Thank you. I'd like us now perhaps to turn to you, Robert, and to look at another aspect of the continuities and discontinuities between the League and the UN. You worked here as a translator, and you're doing research on the integration of the translation service into the institutional structure at the League Secretariat. So you have this sort of dual experience of practitioner and as researcher. So we'd be very glad to have your views on these ruptures and continuities between the two organizations on a very specific and not very well known topic of the role of translators. So translators and interpreters' work is not often in the spotlight, but it's a very pivotal role for multilateral cooperation. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the work of translators at the time of the League of Nations, and tell us to what extent the work of the League's translator service was new and innovative at the time, and how were translators, for example, selected?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for both of those questions. They're extremely interesting. I'd like to pick up on something that Karen's just said about the improvisation. The League itself, as you mentioned, was a great experiment. The Secretariat was a great experiment in international administration, and the translation service itself was an experiment in building a service that was capable of meeting the uniquely wide-ranging demands placed upon it by this new global multi-purpose organization, which had two official languages. And that was a great challenge. And I have to say, at the beginning, things didn't start very well. There was a lot of improvisation, and there was a lack of direction, really, within the service, so that that was quite normal in a sense, that it was moving on an empirical basis, and there was a constant need for reorganization. And in fact, these reorganization processes are very interesting for researchers because they generate a huge amount of documents and materials in the form of memoranda, submissions to committees of inquiry, and official reports, meeting minutes, etc., which give us glimpses actually into the workings of the Secretariat and the power relations within the different departments. And this is really fascinating. And the first major reorganization that the translator service underwent was in 1920, at the end of the year, and the date is important because it was after the first assembly, and there was a realization that there were real basic problems in the translation service. The head of the French translation service said that it had been scraped together in a very haphazard way. And I think there were two reasons for this. There was a structural reason, and there was a question of appointment of personnel. And the problem was that Sir Eric Drummond, the first Secretary General, had basically drawn up his framework for the Secretariat along the lines of the British Civil Service, which was one of its main features, that it was divided into, on the one hand, intellectual tasks, which were to be carried out by the best brains of their generation, and mechanical tasks, which was the routine work of the civil service. And it would include clerical staff, such as stenographers, bilingual stenographers, and translators. Now, the problem was that the translation service in the British Civil Service was really quite a marginal activity, whereas what you've just said is that in the League it would become pivotal. And so there was a problem at the beginning about who to recruit. So that there were two competing views. On the one hand, you had Sir Eric Drummond thinking, well, we need civil service translators. And then it soon became clear that other people were needed, and other people were in fact recruited, and you have a whole mixture of people with different levels, different abilities, and things were not working. Errors were made in translation. There was a lack of direction at the top, and so there was finally a big debate about who do we need, what kind of capabilities, what kind of skills do these translators require. And there was a group of very good revisers on the French side of things who drew up a memo analyzing the type of work that was required, very detailed work, very sensitive work. And they basically wanted to import a French kind of university system. So they said, we need people with very high qualifications, doctorates, agrégation, at the very least, a strong first degree. And on the other hand, there was Francis Walters, who was the private secretary of Sir Eric Drummond, said, well, actually, no, we don't need this all rare combination of skills that the French people think we need. Basically, translating is an art and is possessed by people who have few other unusual qualities. And in fact, women are very good at translating. So all we need to do is to go to universities, recruit young women who are just graduating in languages, bring them here, train them up, and pay them something like £7 a week, £350 a year, which is what they would get as teachers, whereas the French were saying we need people who with degrees who are going to have to be paid £800,000 or something like that. Their view prevailed, and from that moment on, a robust recruitment procedure was put in place, which involved a very stiff competitive examination, an oral interview. Very few people were selected, so perhaps 60, 100 people might take part in the written examination, and only 10, 11 or 12 might be selected, and then they were given a trial in the actual work of the League, particularly during the very busy periods, the assemblies, and perhaps 2 people would be selected for a permanent position. And exams were held every 2 or 3 years or so. In terms of the work that they were doing, at the beginning it was work of a fairly general nature, political nature, but very quickly, as the organizations, technical committees started producing their documents and getting really going, the work became increasingly technical. So by 1927, more or less, 3/4 of the work was technical, and it covered a whole range of topics from economics, finance, medicine, hygiene, transit. Extremely difficult to keep up with the vocabulary, the phraseology that was needed by the translators. And as one former translator of the League said, it was a heroic task to actually keep up, and it put a great strain on people. And the work was continuous. People were not able to take their normal allowance of leave. There was great strain on their health. And what kept them going was their devotion to the League. They were people who believed fundamentally in the purposes of the League. And it was their zeal which, Chester Purvis, the former translator, said, often received scant appreciation, that ensured that the work was done to the very high level that it reached, and that the League as a whole was able to function very smoothly.
We can really see the development of the service through what you're saying. Very interesting. What, in your own work, were you able to see these discontinuities and continuities between the two organizations?
Absolutely. You know, when I started my research, I was in the fortunate position that I was in Geneva and I was able to go into the archives and worked under the expert guidance of the archivists. And I started with the personnel files, you know, and I was reading through these personal files, and of course you have the correspondence about the recruitment. You actually have the examination scripts, and you can see the annotations of the examiners. And then I began to understand that they came to Geneva, they wrote in these little booklets, and then they came to do these trial periods. And as I was sitting there looking at this, I was thinking, well, this is exactly what I did in 2009, that I was following a path that had been forged by my predecessors over 100 years, well, 100 years before almost at that time. And this was very striking, and it touched me quite personally, that they had created this path which hundreds, thousands of UN translators had followed as they were recruited. So there was a very strong continuous thread there. And I think, as has been mentioned already, this was natural in a sense, because many of the League translators went on to staff the new secretariat. People were working. The head of the French translation service became the head of the translation service in Geneva for a while, the European operations, and translators went to New York, to Lake Success, etc., and put in place the same procedures. And you know, so there is that direct continuity. Obviously, there have been a number of changes, institutional changes, but also technological changes. For example, one important institutional change is the question of the official languages. The League had two official languages, English and French, and that was basically, they were simply following the precedent which had been set at the Paris Peace Conference. The UN has 6 official languages, and so there are 6 language services, and in any given language service, the translators will translate out of the other 5. So you would think that the League translators were actually translating the fewer languages. Well, that wasn't the case at all. Although the League documents would be published in both French and English normally, states could make submissions, experts could make submissions in any language, basically. So the League translators had to work out of some 17 languages or so. So not only English and French, but German, Spanish, Italian, Dutch, Flemish, Catalan, the Slavonic languages, the Scandinavian languages. So that was an enormous challenge for the translation services to recruit people who were capable of translating from those languages. Another discontinuity is the way people work today. Of course, translation, I saw UN websites described as a high-tech activity. Electronic flows of documents. The translators are working with their laptops. They have computer-assisted translation tools. Everything is online. Of course, it was very different in the day of the League of Nations, when translators, one interesting thing is that they would dictate. They would perhaps make a rough translation with a pen, but then they would dictate to stenographers. And that was quite a difficult task for some people. Some people couldn't adapt to that. And there's a very interesting description by one former translator in his memoirs who says that he had the stenographer there, And when he was hesitating, she used to tap the table leg with her foot to incite him to carry on. And he said it encouraged him to translate and dictate very quickly. But translators were notoriously slow. There was a study done on the rationalization of the translation service. The stenographers, and they were saying, well, they take as long to dictate as it takes a stenographer to transcribe what they're from her notes, so that they were under pressure to work quickly, and that was difficult.
It does sound very complex. You explain it very well, really make it quite vivid. I'd like to come back to Professor Gram-Skjoldager and perhaps have a wider view. Because, Karen, you conducted an important research project on the emergence and development of 20th century international bureaucracy. So considering just what Mr. Dickinson said, could you tell us to what extent the Secretariat of the League can be considered as a model or as similar to the Secretariat of the United Nations in terms of these professional norms and practice?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure I can answer it precisely. Maybe the most precise way of thinking about it is that the League Secretariat represented a very important formative experience that came to shape the UN Secretariat, both in terms of what worked and what didn't work. So a lot of League officials spent part of their time during the Second World War trying to summarize the experiences that they'd made as international civil servants and try to pass that on to the people who would be working on developing the new international organization that came to be the UN after the war. And you can see many sort of key principles and problems are being described in these documents that are very recognizable today. So how do you create international institutions that are neutral, that are autonomous, but which are at the same time receptive to the interests of their member states and the power structures within which they operate? That's sort of an enduring problem that's the same in 1919 and today. And so you can see some really deep continuities. But you can also see that you have to work in a different way when you have an organization with thousands of members of staff. You have to professionalize recruitment structures. You have to develop more clear career patterns. You have to work more systematically with diversities. So there are also areas where I think a contemporary UN official would be quite shocked to see some of the sort of make-do kind of improvised solutions that characterized the League in its early years. But a lot of that, I think, was then sort of explored and analyzed and then passed on to the UN. So it's sort of a complex learning experience, not just sort of automatic continuities.
Thank you. A lot less improvisation. Perhaps now we can turn to our final speaker, Stefan. He's joining us, I believe, from a library room in Vienna at the Office on Drugs and Crime. You're very familiar with our archives, as we know, and we're glad to have you back with us today. Welcome, Stefan. It may not be very well known, but international drug control has a very long and fascinating history. Can you tell us a bit more about the multilateral efforts in the field of international drug control, and particularly about the work of the League and of the UN, of course?
Thank you, Amy, for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to attend this event and contribute to it. It was a real pleasure hearing from Karen and Robert. And I had the pleasure when I was in Geneva of also collaborating with Karen in relation in the run-up to the publication of the Perspectives book. When I was in Geneva, I was, as you Amy said at the beginning, in charge of the archives unit at the UN Library in Geneva, the institutional memory section. And I also worked with the UN Museum Geneva, and in 2019 and 2020, I was heading the communication and outreach project that the library did on behalf of the UN office at Geneva, which was essentially looking at the evolution of multilateralism from the League to the UN. It was called 100 Years of Multilateralism in Geneva, and it looked at some of these aspects that were touched upon previously, and that I will also share in my presentation. And we looked at how the League laid certain foundations for the UN, but how the work of the UN evolved later on, how good things have been taken over, and things that didn't work so well were improved on. And as both Karen and Robert said, we looked in this during this program, and it can be obvious when one researches the League that there were many things that were developed on the go. Improvisation was the word that was used quite a bit. We should also not forget that with the experiment of the League, there was also improvisation and doing things on the go when it comes in general to multilateral cooperation, to solving international issues. So the League was constantly evolving during its process, and the UN had a lot to learn from the League, and it has learned quite a lot, both things that worked well and things that didn't work so well, and it did quite a lot to improve on that. I think Karen used the phrase that the League in many respects was a stepping stone for the UN in certain areas, especially also when it comes to the establishment of the Secretariat. I would also like to recall that I think it was in the 1960s, the Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, gave a speech at the University of Oxford, I believe, where he said that the experiment of the League and the groundwork laid by Sir Eric Drummond as the Secretary of the League in establishing the Secretariat was a great lesson and an important step for the UN in establishing its own Secretariat. And as Karen said also, the scale is completely different. The UN has established a structure that is much more hierarchical, much more structured, much better organized, and covers a broader range of issues, and has many procedures in practice that are much more developed and much more responsive to the needs of the world than it was the case at the time of the League. Obviously also due to differences of the political climates when the two organizations were made and when the two organizations operated. And there were many areas of work where the League was not particularly successful, but the ones where it was more successful and where it offered more lessons for the UN were the ones that are usually dubbed technical areas of work. And I now work in one of those areas here in Vienna. Drug control is one of the areas of work that was part of these technical assignments of the League. So it's the cooperation of member states in ensuring the use of narcotic drugs for medical and scientific purposes and limiting their diversion into illicit channels. Actually, the office where I work today, Secretariat of the International Narcotics Control Board, is one of those offices of the UN where it's relatively easy to follow the evolution, progression, continuities, and changes between the League and the UN quite directly, because it was a relatively easily traceable development, and it's all very well documented. And whereas I encountered this as a positive example where the evolution from the League to the UN can be traced very easily already when I was in Geneva. And this is actually what drew me to a large extent to apply to come here to this office. Once I came here and I continued doing some research, and in particular for this event, I was actually quite surprised to see how easy it is to look at this and to draw parallels, see when things worked well, how the UN took that over, and how, when the things didn't work so well, the UN found ways to overcome certain obstacles and establish new ways of doing things that overcame the difficulties that the League faced. And so narcotics control has a relatively clear evolutionary path and continuity, even starting before the League of Nations. So one can trace very easily the direct developments from the first International Opium Convention from 1912 that was signed in The Hague. Negotiations initially took place also in Shanghai. Then the evolution that took place during the time of the League with the adoption of the Geneva Conventions, the 1925 Opium Convention and the 1935 Limitations Convention, to then protocols that were adopted under the auspices of the UN in 46, 48 and 53 that brought all of these legal treaties, legal instruments together, to finally the 1961 Single Convention on narcotic drugs that laid the foundation for the establishment of the International Narcotics Control Board, and the 72 Protocol that amended it, and then the subsequent complementary conventions of 71 and 88 that sort of expanded and completed the framework of international drug control, going beyond just the narcotic drugs, also to psychotropic substances, and to a certain extent to precursor chemicals that are used for the manufacture of drugs. And the current Secretariat of the International Narcotics Control Board has grown in size compared to how the comparable body was in the time of the League of Nations. But there is also a clear evolutionary path of the international bodies in that respect. So the Permanent Central Opium Board was established in the 1920s. It was supplemented by the 1931 Supervisory Body following the 1931 Convention. And those two bodies later on were merged into the International Narcotics Control Board once it was established in 1968 after the 1961 Convention entered into force. And as I mentioned, this evolution and growth from the League to the UN was very clear. It's sort of relatively easy to trace. For instance, if you look, a very interesting document that I found was correspondence. I believe it was in 1946, and I think it will be linked to the event. Is the correspondence between the last secretary of the Permanent Opium Board and the acting secretary of the UN at the time. I think it was still during the negotiations on establishing United Nations as an organization, but their correspondence clearly shows that there was a plan and intention to incorporate the Opium Board and its work and its legacy into the work of the United Nations, and the transfer of the League's work in this area was pretty much done straightforward, obviously with certain changes and evolutions later down the road, some of which were deemed also necessary during the League, but the League itself didn't have the capacity. I think Karen used the term institutional muscle, was not as strong to enact those changes. So the League bodies dealing with drug control were much more limited in their scope and in their strength than the ones under the UN auspices are. Even the decision-making body that is tasked at the UN level of deciding which drugs are under control. It's called the Commission on Narcotics Drugs, CND, is a direct descendant of the Advisory Committee on Traffic in Opium and Other Dangerous Substances that operated under the auspices of the League. And that body was incorporated into the UN structure by a decision of the General Assembly. I think Robert spoke quite a bit also about the work of the staff in both one and the other organization and sort of cross-pollination in that respect between the two organizations. This has also happened when it comes to control of narcotic drugs, and even the commentary on the 1961 Convention and the commentary on the 72 Protocol that are the official documents signed by the Secretary General of the UN that help interpret the 1961 Convention. They were actually drafted by former officials of the Opium Board that was under the League. So the influence of the League in this respect continued even after the League ceased to exist. And this is, there are also, in addition to these organizational and continuities and the tracing of the evolution that we can see in the document, there are also certain similarities that can be observed in how the two bodies, the Central Opium Board under the League and the International Narcotics Control Board until the UN have been established. They are both independent bodies comprised of experts and supported in their work by the Secretariat of the World Organization. They have similar scope of work, similar objectives, similar ways of collecting data, presenting data, similar organization of work, but also facing some of the similar issues and considering how they can respond to the challenges. It's done in similar ways.
So we see a real direct transfer and the importance of drug control, both at the time of the League of Nations and carrying on into the United Nations. Perhaps a little bit more specifically, in your current work now, what are the continuities that you see as a practitioner working in this field, very directly?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I have been able to observe those very much, and it's important here, I think, to emphasize the fact that the UN brought many innovations, expanded the work of the League has done in this area, and sort of fixed many of the issues that were plaguing the drug control at the time. But yes, both organizations ascribed very strong importance to this area, and when it comes to the actual similarities that I see today, later on, I think at the end of the event, we will be showcasing some of the interesting documents from the archival collection. And the one that I will be showing is actually related directly to the work that I do today. I mentioned earlier that the way the INCB today collects data, works with data, what objectives it has with collecting data on drugs from member states is very similar to what was done during the time of the League, and some of the practices in that respect were established by the League, and some of them essentially obviously underwent evolution under the UN and the INCB, but the basic tenets remain the same. Some of the forms on which we collect data not only have the same names as they did during the time of the League of Nations, but they collect very similar data and work in a similar fashion. We exchange with member states in a similar way at set intervals of the year. They submit to us, they furnish to us the official data, we look at it, we exchange with them, we present this data to understand the evolution of the development, at the international level when it comes to availability of drugs. We look at the risks of diversion of drugs into illicit channels. We collect quarterly trade data and issue or help member states in issuing licenses for import and export. This similar work was done by the League. However, the framework within the UN context is much more streamlined, and it is more it is better adjusted to accommodate for the evolutions in both the scientific and medical developments on the ground, but also in changing legislation in member states. So while the League was plagued with the rigidity of the conventions that were adopted and that it worked under, and also with the structures of the limitations of the mandates of the board when it came to oversight of the work of the countries. These shortcomings were recognized, and first with the streamlining of the conventions, but then also with the streamlining of the work, the UN's roles, the INCB's roles were expanded, and the shortcomings were overcome, and different new systems were introduced that now today help us work better and overcome more easily the challenges and the changes that show up in the system. For instance, the emergence of new drugs, there's now in place a scheduling system where drugs are scheduled and the control is expanded in that way, and there is no need to revisit and revise the international documents. The IMCB now has much more control over the trade that the member states do, and assists the UNODC as another body within the UN system that deals particularly with illicit drugs. At the IMCB, we have several programs that monitor illicit trade in drugs, and we support UNODC in that respect. We have the capacity to assist member states to learn and improve their skills when it comes to what they need to do to comply with the conventions. We have sections that deal with different types of drugs and with different aspects of drug control, technical, legal, and so forth. So in that respect, we're a much larger organization than the comparable body was under the League of Nations. However, here I want to point out in the course of my research, and I think this is one of the other documents that will be linked, the League recognized some of the shortcomings in the way the drug control system was established under its auspices, and it proposed on several occasions ways to amend this and to improve the system and to make it more robust. And I found one particular report from the advisory committee submitted to the League's council, and some of the proposed amendments to the framework of the League's control of the narcotics drugs to me looked very similar, because this is how the IMCB looks today. So some of the ideas that the League had on how it should improve its work in drug control later carried over to the UN, and they were luckily recognized. There was an important article in the Columbia Law Review in 1946, I believe it was published, or 1945, that is also available in the League archives at Geneva, where this framework, ideal framework for the desired framework for the improvement of the board was proposed, and some of those proposals made it in the way the INCB is established today. And we can see that to this day today, when I discuss with my colleagues in the course of my research the similarities that I discover, we actually very often sit down and sort of wonder at how many similarities there are, obviously keeping in mind that our work today is much more broad and complex than what it was back then.
Thank you, Stefan. So a lot of similarities, but an awful lot of refinement and amendment and adaptation to today's needs. I'd like to come back maybe to Karen and to ask you, there are so many differences between the work of the League and the work of the UN, but are there other examples that perhaps you could give where the League was a pioneer of activities that have been continued by the UN?
Yes, in that sense, I might draw on my own research where we worked, as was mentioned earlier, on the League Secretariat. And what we discovered in that sense is that sort of the very concrete regulations for being a League of Nations civil servant carried on almost unchanged into the post-war years. So issues of can you take up side jobs while you're working in the League? Can you receive international orders? Are you allowed to give talks without permission of your manager? All these kinds of sort of nitty-bitty pieces of being a professional and neutral international civil servant was taking over almost one-to-one by the UN Secretariat and also other international organizations' Secretariat. And we actually managed to trace some of these principles still being alive and well up until 2003. So some really long continuities in sort of the technical aspects of running an international organization administration, we can follow very clearly through almost a century.
Thank you. Yes, and we do see those still today. Well, promoting the archives is really at the core of this history series, and you can access the entirety of the League of Nations archives via our online platform, the UN Archives Geneva platform. It was launched in December 21, and since then we've had more than 100,000 users consulting documents online. So before this event, we asked our speakers to select one document that they find very relevant to this discussion on continuities and discontinuities between the League and the UN. And from amongst the 40 million pages that we have digitized, it's not an easy choice, but they have come up with some documents and they have 90 seconds to present them. Let's start with you, Karen.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was a very difficult choice, but I ended up choosing a note, as you can maybe see, from the last Secretary General of the League of Nations, an Irishman called Sean Lester, who on the 13th of April in 1945 wrote a very frustrated text on how the League of Nations Secretariat delegation had been received at the San Francisco conference. So the foundational conference of the UN, because what they discovered when they arrived was that no arrangements had been made for their participation in the conference, no plans on how they should register, how they could receive documents. There were no seating available for them, so they ended up at the very back benches of the San Francisco Opera House at the opening event of the conference. And they were been given shared bedrooms in a third-class hotel where no other government officials resided. And I think this is a very concrete and very powerful image of how the founders of the UN tried to dissociate themselves and their new organization with the League and its perceived failure, and to try and create a fresh start and a new narrative for the new organization. And I think that also explains why Lester is so comparatively frustrated, because it's very clear that this is not just a practical problem, it's a symbolic gesture. But what I particularly like about this document is in the very last section, which I think is just as telling, where Lester ends up highlighting the informal continuities and transfers between the League and the UN, when he states that many of the members of the old League Secretariat who were in town as national delegation representatives ended up assisting the Secretariat running the conference, because it was fairly chaotic and untrained in organizing multilateral conference diplomacy. So they lend a hand to the new Secretariat in running the conference in a professional way. So what we see is this formal and symbolic discontinuity being staged by the UN, but at the same time, these very clear, practical and informal continuities at the same time.
That's a fabulous example. Thank you so much. Let's now turn to Robert's choice.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Well, this is a special circular that was drafted by the head of the English Translation Service in 1921. And it relates to this issue that I mentioned earlier about the number of languages that the service had to translate out of. And we've been talking about improvisation, but I hope I haven't given the impression that these people were not extremely professional. They were. And this is indicated in this document, that the head of the service was very concerned that documents that have been translated out of languages which were not the official languages were being sent out into the world, as he said, without any indication of their provenance. And his problem was that he had people who could translate out of these lesser used languages as they were described, but he had no revisers, so he couldn't be held responsible for the standard. And he said that their translators had a knowledge of these other languages, but their standard of knowledge was not quite the same. So he wanted to ensure that it was very clear that these documents were in some way not as authoritative as the documents that were being issued in English and French. So I think that indicates that the very high standards they set for themselves and they set for the Secretariat. Now, what is particularly particularly interesting about this document, I find. It illustrates the issue that I've mentioned there, but it also illustrates the amount of detail that we can find in the League archives, which can illuminate our studies. And what is particularly fascinating is that to make his point, the difficulties faced, the number of languages that they had to translate out of, and the type of documents that they were struggling with, Geoffrey Dennis actually gives a list of the 11 documents that his 11 translators were working on August the 3rd, 1921. So as I look at this list, it's as though I'm moving from room to room, looking over the shoulder of the translators, like seeing what they were doing, and it's an amazing snapshot. So I'll just give you a flavor. There were 11 documents, so they were translating out of Italian, French, of course, Spanish, German, Portuguese, Dutch, and again, German. And what kind of documents were they translating? Well, for example, there was a Czechoslovak treaty with Germany, which was, he describes as long and difficult document requiring a perfect knowledge of legal phraseology. There was Austria's reply with regard to the Blockade Commission, reply in respect of certain statistical inquiries for the economics section. So they had the complications of the languages, they had the difficulty of the texts themselves, and as Geoffrey Dennis says, this list speaks for itself. And so it was really a plea for him to be able to recruit more translators, or for states to be encouraged to submit documents in English or French, and it indicates the very high standard which they set for themselves, and they really wanted that to be clear, that the documents that were going out were the very highest possible standards that could be achieved with the resources they had, because resources were necessarily limited for financial stringencies that existed throughout the life of the League Secretariat.
It really does illustrate the difficulties and importance of the work of translators. And now to you, Stefan. What have you chosen? Stefan, I think we have a problem with the sound for you.
Apologies, yes, I did not unmute. Sorry. Thank you. I chose a document that is very interesting because it relates to my work today. I was torn. There were, as Karen, I was faced with a choice of so many interesting documents, whether I should use that letter that I mentioned earlier, in which the acting UN Secretary General said that the board should continue operating and the duties should be taken over. But I chose this particular document because it is very illustrative of the answer to the question that you had earlier, Amy, and that I hinted at about the similarities that I see in the work today. So the document that you see here, it's called Form B. It's one of the official statistics forms that was collected by the League of Nations, on which member states submitted their annual estimates for the need of narcotic drugs for medical and scientific purposes. And we work in a similar fashion today, collecting these estimates, and not only is our form for this purpose today also called Form B, and I myself also work with this document. But when you see it, I had a privilege of, as an ex-colleague, asking for another document to be put in there. The document that you see next to it is the Form B that we use today. They are essentially almost identical in the way they look and in the way they collect data and in the way that they are later processed. So to me, this was the biggest surprise when I conducted my research into the similarities of the League's board and the UN's IMCB, and I think it's a very interesting illustration. Robert earlier said how he could feel like he could peek over the shoulders of the translators and interpreters in the day of the League. I can say I feel in the same way. I can imagine how my colleagues 78 years ago felt when they dealt with these forms, and it's really interesting and really humbling to be continuing this history and to see it so vividly today.
Thank you, Stefan. It's a really, truly striking similarity. So links to these documents will be available in our notes, and we're coming to the end of this HiStories episode. So I would like to thank our three speakers very, very much for their contributions, and to you, of course, for watching online. Again, information from our UN Archives Geneva platform and our other online resources at the Library and Archives are available in the notes, and our archivists and librarians are available to assist you with any research or any questions you have about this episode or anything else. Thank you.
Thank you.